Welcome to this week's episode of Being Human. I'm here from Bjarte Bogsnes. He's calling in all the way from Norway. Am I right?
Right.
Bjarte, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Now, Bjarte is an author. He's the chairman of Beyond Budgeting, which we'll get into, and the author of the book Implementing Beyond Budgeting, Unlocking the Performance Potential. He's also a senior practitioner within the corporate performance division of Equinor, which of course is a large oil company or, I suppose, energy company, majority owned by Norway, if I'm not mistaken. So Bjarte, it's a great honor and a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you for the invitation.
Now, one might immediately ask, why have we got a guest on this show with an interest in budgeting when the podcast is about being human? And I promise you that budgeting, or the lack of budgeting, has everything to do with our humanity in the workplace. But before we get into that, which I'm sure we will do, shall we start with a brief history of why it is we have this soul-crushing process that so many of us experience within the corporate workplace of budgeting? You know, why do so many of us have to endure it?
That is a very good question. And there was actually a reason for this quite some time ago, because what we talk about here is pretty old management technology, invented roughly 100 years ago. And in case you don't know, the inventor was Mr. James O. McKinsey, the founder of McKinsey Consulting, right? And I never met Mr. McKinsey, but actually I don't think he was an evil man. I think he actually had the best of intentions. Purpose was to help organizations perform better. And I actually think it worked 100 years ago. And maybe even 50 years ago, but no longer today, because today things have changed. Today, this way of not just managing, but this way of thinking, this kind of mindset is doing the opposite of what Mr. McKinsey wanted. It has become more of a barrier than a support for getting out the best possible performance in organizations. And another problem, well, there are many problems with budgeting, but one of those problems is related to two fundamental assumptions behind maybe not just budgeting, but traditional management in general, but specifically budgeting. The first one is that people can't be trusted, and the second one is that the future is predictable and plannable. And we are challenging both those assumptions heavily in Beyond Budgeting because we don't think that's the case. So this is where it's coming from. And you are right. The big majority of companies out there are still doing this stuff, despite the fact that so many are unhappy with it. Fortunately, things are changing. We are extremely busy these days because the interest in Beyond Budgeting has really exploded. Of course, COVID as COVID-19 and the pandemic has helped. At the same time, we have been through big crisis before. I mean, we had a financial crisis some time ago, but I think this one is different because these earlier crises, they only challenged this first assumption in traditional management, or the second assumption that the future is predictable and plannable. But it did not change this assumption that you can't trust people. Whereas in COVID, also that assumption has been challenged through all the homework. Right? A lot of companies actually had to trust their people, even if they didn't want to. And it actually worked. Right? So if I should look for something positive coming out of this, maybe that is something.
Right. And so budgets have existed because we believe we can predict the future and people can't be trusted. And so therefore a budget is some way to control them and have them do what we want. And now we have Enter Stage Left Beyond Budgeting, which was a book written some time ago now, right? And when was Beyond Budgeting first written?
The original book came out in 2003, I think.
Yeah.
Jeremy Hope and Robin Fraser. That was the first one.
Right. And give us the kind of the elevator pitch of Beyond Budgeting, and then sort of where you first encountered it.
Well, I think I just gave it the pitch. I mean, I think these when I remind people about these two assumptions, I mean, it gets people to think. So I think it would be along those lines. My journey, well, this is a long story, but my journey started back in 1994. But I actually started my career earlier, back in 1983, when I joined Statoil, as we were called back then. We changed name to Equinor. And in case you don't know, my first job was in the corporate budget department of that company, where I became the manager the year after. So, I mean, I have done a lot of stupid things in my life, at least in my early part of my career. But it also means that I know what I'm talking about. I think it gives me some credibility here because I've been there, I've done that. In 1994, Statoil at the time established a new petrochemicals company together with Finnish Neste, also an energy company. Borealis was Europe's largest petrochemicals company at the time, with 30 plants across Europe and headquartered in Copenhagen. And I was asked to head up the finance function in this company. And we started operations March 1, 1994. And it didn't take many days before people came to us and asked, where is the budget for 1994? We can't operate without a budget. And as finance people, we agreed, of course, we need a budget. So we started to make one on top of everything else that you need to do when you're setting up a new company, with recruiting people, setting up systems, and moving to Copenhagen with your family, and you name it. And but we were actually still able to make a budget, finished some maybe in June of that year. Everybody happy, even if half the year had passed already. But it didn't take many days before people started to ask about the 1995 budget. We have to start it. It's already late. It's summer. And again, we agreed, started to make that one. And sometimes in late October, early November, that budget was finished. And the only energy we had left, we used for a day out at the hotel outside of Copenhagen. We gathered the key finance people from across Europe. And the purpose of that day was to improve budgeting in Borealis. So we spent this day having completely unimportant discussions. Shall we move this column from here to here in order to simplify? Shall we stop asking for this number in order to simplify? And towards the end of that day, as we were about to move another column, we suddenly heard from a guy down in the corner, normally quite active, but during this day he had been very silent. Suddenly we heard from this guy, what if we don't budget at all? The room became dead. The room became dead silent. Everybody turned around, looked at the guy. Nobody said anything, but I think we were all thinking the same. This guy probably needs a... And that was it. Unthinkable, right? So nothing. Still, that comment came a kind of defining moment, because I think it was half a year after, into 1995, the company realized that the synergies that we have gotten out of establishing this company, it wasn't enough. It's a very competitive business. So, the answer became what was big in the 90s, business process re-engineering. You might remember that.
Yes.
There's a lot of consultants that have earned a lot of money on that stuff. But anyway, it's only common sense. Turn every stone, look for a better way. And I was asked to head up something called management effectiveness. I didn't invent that label myself, so I went to the CFO and I asked, what do you mean? And also, what do you expect? And he just smiled, and then he said, Bjarte, I expect the unexpected. That was the mandate. I went back to my team and shared this with them. And it didn't take long before that comment from the guy down in the corner came back to us. Of course, we knew that this wasn't the most intelligent process in the world, but kind of to kick it out had seemed unthinkable up till now. So we thought, well, could this be a chance to do something here? So we went back to the CFO and proposed or told him that we want to kick out the budget. He smiled again, and then he said, well, that sounds interesting, but what shall we then do instead? Well, we had to admit we don't have a clue. Maybe you shall go and find out, was his message to us. And that's what we did. So we started to search an alternative to traditional budgets. And, this was before, there was nothing called beyond budgeting. So it wasn't that easy. And also search in 1995, that wasn't Google, right? That was calling people, reading, discussing. And that's what we did. Week after week, we couldn't find anything. And there was a little glimmer of hope because we came across an article in a Swedish magazine which says that Volvo kicks out the budget. We went up to Gothenburg, to their headquarters.
And who'd have thought that purveyor of such sensible cars would be the one to
Well, they had done some interesting things, but we were after something more radical. So back to Copenhagen, continue to search. By the way, today, Volvo, they have kicked out budgets in a much more radical way. But anyway, another glimmer of hope, because we came across Jack Welch and what he had said about budgets being the bane of corporate America. And we thought, if that guy can say this, we must be onto something. A little sidestep on this story, because many years later, I was actually invited to GE when Jeff Immelt was the CEO, because they had come across beyond budgeting and was interested. And they have a legendary management gathering in the US once a year, 600 top managers. I did my session, and afterwards, a lot of people came over and said that, what Jack said, that was for the outside world. Inside, GE was still budget tyranny. But anyway, back to Copenhagen, continue to search. And I think we were this close to giving up. When there was another defining moment, there was a guy on the team suddenly asking, why do we budget? What's the purpose of a budget? And first we thought, what kind of question is that? But it turned out to be a great question that cracked it all, provided us with the solutions, and enabled us to kick out the traditional budget. So from 96, we operated without traditional budgets, and it worked perfectly. Cost actually came down.
Yeah, and that's a story over and over in the book, right? It's totally counterintuitive that you kick out budgets, and example after example, and costs go down.
Yeah. Now it's, and I think we were actually, I had to admit, we were concerned that cost will increase somewhat, but actually the opposite happened. So this was 96. 1998, I moved from finance to HR to head up the HR function in the same company. And I had that role until 2002, when I returned back to Statoil and became corporate controller for our international business. But my hobby at the time, that was to pester my colleagues with the stupidity of the budgeting that the company was doing at the time. And looking back, I don't think I was very diplomatic, but slowly, actually took 3 years. Then we had this common understanding that there are serious problems, there are solutions. So we went to the executive committee and proposed not just to kick out the budget. This has become bigger. It was more about changing how we were leading and managing. And we got a yes. And since then, I have been working full time on beyond budgeting, internally in the company, doing leadership training, further development of the model, and externally speaking like this, doing some consulting and also writing. So I have this roughly 50-50 split between what I do internally and what I do externally.
Right.
So that's a long story.
Right. So, okay. So I just want to place you back in Borealis, right? So you take this big step, to kick out the budgets there, and you see costs down. Like, what are the some of the other things that start to happen? Like, talk us through that, and what do you put in its place, and what starts to happen as you go on that journey?
Well, it's I think the reason why costs often go down, and we've seen this over and over again. I can give you another example here before I answer your question. In the public sector in Norway, I can't name which one as such, but it's they've been running 2 pilots with 2 other units. So in 2020, they took away the cost budgets in both of these units, and they said, you spend what is needed in order to get your work done. And then when the year was over, they looked at the results, and actually cost, because of the pandemic, costs in all these units came down because there was less travel and less external activities. But none units had higher cost reductions than the 2 pilots, 50% in both of them.
Wow.
So, and reasons, well, first of all, there are so many reasons, but one reason is that people think about the budget as a very effective ceiling that we put on cost, and that's true, but it is just effective as a floor in the sense that the budgets tend to be spent. And also when people propose budgets, when they know that, or cost budgets, when they know this is my only shot at getting access to resources for next year. And some people might remember that 20% cut from last year. I mean, of course, you build fat into your proposals, right? And some of it might be taken out, but yeah.
Yeah, and of course, nobody wants to come in underspent and get less money next year, right?
Yeah, yes, of course. So, and again, everybody knows this game, right? And but you asked about how to get started. Well, we'll get back to that question in Borealis. What's the purpose of a budget? And here comes a little finance session as such, because the budget has actually 3 different purposes. We use budgets to set targets, financial targets, sales targets, production targets. At the same time, this budget is meant to be a kind of forecast of what next year can look like in terms of cash flow, financial capacity. And last but not least, it is a resource allocation mechanism, handing out bags of money to people on costs on investments, right? So resource allocation. And it might seem very efficient to solve 3 purposes in one process and through one set of numbers. But that is also the problem, right? I mean, right. Let's assume we are moving into a budget process, and upstairs in corporate finance, we want to understand, starting with revenues, we want to understand what next year could look like, or what we ask people, what's your best number for next year? But everybody knows that the number I'm sending upstairs will come back to me as a target for next year, maybe with a bonus attached. Well, that insight might actually do something to the level of numbers submitted. And moving to the cost and investment side, as we just talked about, I mean, when people know that my only shot, and they remember last year's 20% cut, that insight and that memory might also do something with the numbers submitted. And we might smile a bit, about all of this, but it's actually not funny. First of all, it destroys the quality of numbers, but even more worrisome is the fact that it stimulates this behavior that is at least borderline unethical. the lowballing, the gaming, the sandbagging, the resource hoarding, the internal negotiations. That's not the kind of behaviors we would like to see.
Yeah, that's
fortunately.
Yeah, I just want to pause on that. I think that's such an important point. Back to this. This is about being human. It's you're literally encouraging people to behave at the outer edges of their integrity, right? It's almost a system that's encouraging people to sort of edge up as close as they feel comfortable with in terms of being honest and behaving with integrity. And that's that's one of the sort of key pillars of the entire organization. So it's such an important point you're making here.
There was actually an article written by a US professor, Jensen, I think he's called, some years ago, and it was called Budgeting Encouraging People to Lie. Or something like that. There
you go. That's a more blunt version of it. Right?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So it is. So I think that problem is much bigger than the fact that you get distorted numbers. Fortunately, there is a very simple solution here. We can still do all these three things, but we should do them in three separate processes because these are different things. A target is an aspiration. It's what we want to happen, while a forecast is an expectation. It's what we think will happen, whether we like what we see or not. And resource allocation is about optimizing scarce resources in order to get to where we want to be. And when we have separated, then not only can this become different numbers, like a target can be more ambitious than a forecast, but even more importantly, this opens up this huge improvement agenda. Because now we can start to have great discussions about how can we set targets that really ignite and inspire and motivate people. How can we set targets that are more robust against all the volatility, uncertainty, and complexity and ambiguity out there? How can we take the politics out of forecasting and the gaming? And how can we design more intelligent ways of managing costs compared to what Mr. McKinsey could offer us 100 years ago? And last but not least, how can we run each of these three on rhythms that are more suited to each purpose and also to the business we are in? Because this also enables you to escape the tyranny of the calendar year. Right? You can get a much more event-driven, business-driven rhythm in these processes.
Yeah.
So this is a great way to get started, and it is also this backdoor into the bigger discussions about beyond budgeting, especially on the people side, right? On this and leadership, because beyond budgeting has 6 leadership principles, 6 management process principles, and so moving into designing target setting. I mean, again, what really motivates the knowledge worker, right? And you get into the whole kind of motivational arena and incentives, individual goals, and so on. And on the cost side, if we say that we trust people, do we need detailed travel budgets, and so on and so on. So I have helped a lot of companies going beyond budgeting, and this is often where we start. It is logical. It is not scary for a CFO, because if somebody says that it's impossible to operate without a budget, my response would be that, well, we are still doing what the budget tried to do for us, but because of the separation, we can do each one in a better way. So how scary is that?
Yeah, and you're using the language they understand: forecasting, targets, yes. Cost control, right? So it's very familiar.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And language is important here because, today a lot of organizations are on huge agile transformation journeys. And I think, and they struggle for different reasons. One reason actually has to do with language, because at least in the beginning, when the agile community were trying to scale agile, they were using the same language and framework that was so successful in revolutionizing software development. But if you apply that that language to a group of executives. And that doesn't always work, right?
What the hell's a scrum master?
Yeah, if you haven't heard, if you don't play rugby, you might think it's a skin disease, right? Or that the sprint is about running faster, or that continuous delivery is about kind of more sweat and more efficient assembly lines, and so on and so on. So beyond budgeting offers a language that these guys understand. They might still disagree, but at least they understand what they're talking about. The other thing is that all these organizations discover, often late on the journey, that there is a missing piece. There's actually an elephant in the room that nobody is addressing, and that is budgeting. Not just the process, but also the mindset. And it's impossible to achieve with an agile transformation unless you also address that part of the process. So we are either the missing piece in such a transformation, or we can be that transformation in itself, because beyond budgeting is actually about business agility. Right? Yeah. So that is a more kind of suitable title, maybe. That wasn't invented when we hit the ground running back in 1998.
Right. Yeah. So take me back to Borealis. So I'm just trying to imagine the scene, right? So you've come up with this idea. You've separated out these three activities. That used to be all conflated under one banner, under budgeting. How do people react? How does that go initially?
Well, first of all, when people heard about the proposal, the response was very positive, because this is a process that most managers hate. That and performance appraisals, I think, are the two most hated processes in any organization. So if you have the courage to do something with at least one of them, then that is basically good news for any change journey. But it was, of course, there was a lot of questions, and I think we were quite good in telling people that this is not necessarily easier from a leadership point of view. This actually takes more leadership, right? Because things will become more fluid, and it will. There are managers who like budgets because they don't like to make decisions. And the more detailed your budget is, the more decisions have been made for you. And you even have someone to blame if some of those decisions are unpopular. Right? And we had some in that category as well, but I think most liked it. And after they had been trying this for a year or two, they worked it out. But of course, there was a lot of questions. And we saw the same in Equinor in 2005 when we got started. That this really it kind of sorts out the good leaders from the less good, to put it that way. It becomes more visible. Absolutely.
Okay.
A nice little side effect, which I often remind finance people about, is that it gave the finance function quite a boost from an image point of view, because the initial reaction, of course, people they thought it was exciting, kick out the budget, but they also, some said that there has to be a hidden agenda. Why would finance voluntarily kick out their power mechanism or
give
process
up their
number
weapons?
One? Yeah, yes, there must be a hidden agenda. When they realized that there was no hidden agenda, I think it gave us a very nice boost from an image point. That was, of course, not the reason for doing it, but still nice. So, but it also changed the role of the finance community, and we've seen the same in Equinor. Much more interesting role, much more forward-looking, much more business-oriented, much more continuous, better collaboration with other functions, including HR, and so on and so on. So it changed. It changed the role of managers. It changed the role of finance to the better, much better.
Right. And you mentioned that in terms of leadership, like it exposes the poor leadership. In what way was it exposing poor leadership?
Well, again, you heard, you of course we had our suspicions already who would be in which category, but you heard it in the kind of who belonging back to the old days, and you heard it about how they talked about this and questions they had for us and so on. But fortunately, I mean, this was a small minority, and I don't think. Well, at least in Equinor, we don't have any discussions about going back. We have a lot of discussions about how to make this work even better. Also, because this is a journey. This is not a project. It is a journey where you get braver along the way, and it's also a journey where the direction is clearer than the destination, to the extent there is a destination. And that's also what I find fascinating, because some people ask, I mean, you've been doing, or Equinor has been doing this since 2005. When are you finished? And I don't think you ever get finished. One example, we spent many years after the separation, and now I'm talking Equinor, setting better financial targets. For instance, using a beyond budgeting recommendation about setting relative targets. So you establish a peer group and you set the target about being above average or first quartile, whatever. And so that we've done. But now we've just cracked open a discussion about, do we need all these targets? Can we do with less? And we actually have opened up for the fact that you can have indicators, as we call them. Instead, we try to call them indicators instead of KPIs. Okay, I can come back to that afterwards. But you can have indicators where you measure something, but you don't have a target. And the reason for that is that target setting can actually have some of the same problems that budgeting had. Not all of them, but some of them. And partly around how they are set, imposed on people, and which there shouldn't be. But also the notion of a target itself should be challenged, because when we set an annual target, we are sitting in the autumn the year before, and we are trying to describe what does good performance look like 12 months down the road. If there's a lot of uncertainty, how on earth do we know what that looks like? What kind of number is it is? So is that 30, 27, right? But we have to conclude, and then we land on 29.2, and that becomes the answer, right? That everything shall be judged against. But one of the purposes of target setting is performance evaluation, right? You have to have something to evaluate in. But at which point in time is it easiest to have a view on what is good performance? Is that upfront in the autumn with all that fog? Or is it afterwards when all the uncertainty is gone and the fog has cleared? You know what happened. Tailwind and headwind and changes in assumptions. And yeah. So I think that kind of shows that you don't need targets in order to evaluate performance. And people say, well, you need targets in order to set direction and to motivate. Well, there are many ways of setting direction and motivating. You can use words, or if you use numbers, you can say, 2 wars or in the range, or always better, or improving all the time, right? But we have this counting mentality that it have to be precise, right? The SMART principles of goals, specific and measurable, and so on. I think SMART has done a lot of damage when it comes to target setting in companies.
Yeah. Well, maybe that's your next book, Bjarte, Beyond Targeting.
Yeah.
Yeah, but no, I think that makes a lot of sense. We had another guest on the show. He's got from the Happiness Company, but he's written a book called Happiness Manifesto, and he just the way that he manages.
Is it Henry Stewart? Or?
Henry Stewart.
Oh, yeah, I know him. Great guy.
Yeah, and
great guy.
Yeah, the way he talks, if he sees a problem in his company, one of the ways he manages it, he just encourages people to be transparent about a particular metric, and that's it.
Yeah.
And he trusts them to adjust their behavior over time to improving their performance against that particular metric. So it's and I think you mentioned it in the book, right? It's management by measurement, not management by objectives, management by measurement.
Yeah. And you mentioned transparency, which is also a very important beyond budgeting principle, which is important from in many aspects. But one of them is actually also cost control, as we talk. because transparency is it is a kind of a social control mechanism, right? And I write about in my book about a company called Mice, Norwegian IT company. They have no budgets, no targets. Employees can buy whatever PC they want, as expensive as they want, and replace it as often as they want. They can attend whatever course, seminar, conference they want, as often as they want, wherever in the world. No travel budgets, no training budgets. But it is not an anarchy. Because when you have bought that PC, when you have returned from that conference, you have to post on the internet what you did and the cost of it. So transparency is their main cost control mechanism, and they are very happy with it. They do have one small concern, however, and do you know what that is?
No, go on.
Some people might think that, well, this is kind of too sloppy and I mean, yeah, not strong enough compared to the good old budget. But it's actually the other way around. The small concern is, could it be too effective? Right. But
what do you mean? What do you mean by too effective? How could you?
Well, are people buying good enough PCs?
Okay.
Are they taking enough training? Right. So, and this is, transparency is a very powerful mechanism. So it has to be applied with wisdom, because if it becomes naming and shaming, it doesn't work. Right. And we should also always position transparency more from a learning perspective than from a control perspective. So how can we learn from each other if everything is secret? And then you get this subtle control mechanism as a side effect, but you have to apply it with caution.
Which is where you can see how targets can be a problem, because it's perhaps more difficult to have a learning environment where you've got a large degree of targeting, because people might feel shame about not reaching their targets. They don't want to open up about where they're not reaching their targets, and so they're not open for learning or feedback. So I can see how the two might conflict with each other, a learning goal and having targets.
And of course, I mean, the more targets there are, the more individual these targets are. I mean, that's also an issue, because people become obsessed on hitting your own numbers, right? And collaboration and everything else kind of walks out the door. And often this is kind of turbocharged with having individual bonuses, which is another elephant in the room. Well, maybe we have arrived at that topic, but I can't think of any area where there's a bigger gap between what most research is telling us and what most businesses are practicing. It's fascinating. And the research, and I'm sure listeners, and you've seen Dan Pink's video and all this stuff. But it's I almost feel like we talked about good leaders. I would call individual bonus is almost managerial laziness, right? It is much easier to dangle a bag of money in front of people's nose and say, do this and get that, and to motivate them through mastery, autonomy, purpose, and belonging, and so on.
Yeah, so that's the really powerful question to ask. It's not like, do targets improve individual performance for complex work? Because we know the answer to that is no. It's why do people still choose to target even when the research exists? That's the more interesting example. But yeah, that sounds like a good. And the illusion of and the other thing you mentioned in your book is the illusion of control. Right? For many people, they want to feel that their environment is controlled, and by targeting people, they feel that somehow they've got more control on that individual, and they'll do the things that they want them to do. Right? Yeah.
And even if people hit their targets, I mean, that says really nothing. It just tells that, well, you hit that number, but it doesn't really say anything about what was that good performance. Could you have performed even better because there was tailwind, or was there a lot of headwind that or did other things change? So it's again, it is this our urge for simplifying the world, right? We don't like what's complex, and we are trying to simplify. And instead of accepting that things are complex and acting accordingly.
Right. No, that makes sense. One quote I just wanted to bring up, which is the book, because I love it, and I just want to sort of wheel it out. comes from the Handelsbanken book, which talks about this, right from the start of the interview, right? This importance of trusting people. We have an unshakable belief in people and their will and ability to do good things well, right? So this is one of the best performing banks in the world, one of the pioneers of kicking out budgets. They have that right up front in their book. We have an unshakable belief in people and their will and ability to do things well. So that unshakable belief. Now, if you have a few bad apples, we're still going to believe in people. We believe in their will, so we don't feel like we have got to target them and put a fire under their ass to get. We just believe that they're going to do it, and we believe in their ability to do good things. So we believe that they're good people, right? We trust that people are good, and that they'll do things well, right? That just sort of captures so much of what we're talking about, I think.
No, it's wonderful words, and they sound even better in Swedish. but
Come on, give it. Do you know them in Swedish? Can you say it in Swedish?
No, I think that's not my language. So I think my Swedish friends will laugh. But it's wonderful words. But it's not that difficult to write nice words in a book. I think the real important thing here is that Handelsbanken they've been able to activate these words into their management processes. Right, because there is a coherence, consistency between what they preach and say in this book and what they practice in their management model. Like no budgets, no targets, no individual bonus. Right, it all hangs together, which is again a very important thing in beyond budgeting. This coherence between the 6 leadership principles and the 6 management processes that we recommend, and in so many organizations, you see a lack of such a coherence. 2 classical examples. I mean, it doesn't matter that we from the leadership side talk loud and warm about we and us and together and team and collaboration, everybody in the same boat. But if you move to management processes, rewards, it's all about individual bonus. That is not criticizing individual bonus; it's criticizing the lack of consistency in messages. All the other classical example that, and I think I touched upon it earlier, that it doesn't help that we talk about how fantastic people we have on board, and we would be nothing without you, and we trust you so much, but not that much. Of course, we need detailed travel budgets. Are you crazy? Right? I mean, this is something that people out there, they notice, right? And the words become hollow because the management processes have the very different message. Yeah. And the reason for this, unfortunately, has actually something to do with finance and HR, which are not always the best of friends in organizations. They tend to talk a lot about each other, not much with each other, and it's not nice what is said on either side. I know because I've been both places. And what happens is that, again, it's very often HR that is kind of preaching and promoting values and leadership and good intended people messages. Then finance is pushing their own management processes that has exactly the opposite message. And guess which one is winning? Right. That was a leading question.
Yeah. No, of course. Well, finance always wins, right? I mean, that's the, and that's why they're so feared in organizations, right?
Oh.
Yeah. No, that's but the point you're making about how common it is in organizations for the values on the elevator or the values on the wall that are actually what plays out. I mean, one organization I know well has a strong value on trust, and yet I know that even senior managers there can't buy a book without permission.
Well, one reflection on trust, by the way. I used to traveled quite a lot before the pandemic, and that meant quite a number of hotel nights. And the first thing I always check when I'm entering the room is what kind of clothing hangers do they have? Because, there are 2 types. There's the normal one with the hook, and you have the one without the hook. Just it's hanging, you have to kind of push it through this little hole and very cumbersome. So how come hotels offer the guests, or at least some hotels offer the guests these awful clothing hangers? Well, the reason is probably that maybe there was a few guests at one point in time that
stole a few of those ordinary hangers with a hook, and the response to put everybody in jail because somebody did something wrong, right? Which is also a problem in traditional management when it comes to trust. Because if you show trust in an organization, the only thing you know for sure is that someone will most likely abuse that trust at some point in time. And when it happens, what is the easy response for a CEO or a CFO? Well, that is to say that, look what happened here and here. This trusting doesn't work. Back to the old way. That's the easy thing to do.
And
the right thing to
that's often to appease the anger of those who are directly affected, right? Sometimes the easiest thing is say, yes, I'll deal with it. We'll put a new rule.
Yeah. You're showing action, right? If you have to do something, but you should do something, but you should do something else. You should take that firm talk with those involved and let it have the necessary consequences if needed. But you shouldn't punish everybody because somebody did something wrong. But that takes a bit more of leadership. You actually have to talk to people, right? In the other option, you can just send out that mail and case closed.
Yeah, we've dealt with it. We've got a new
yes.
Yeah. Rather than confront those who've betrayed the trust and dish out the consequences, right? And have them feel some consequence. Yeah, that takes more leadership. I can completely see that. Yeah. Right. And I think it not just at the top, but I think I remember speaking. So we had the guy who was head of corporate communications, Richard Winder, on here from Handelsbanken.
Right.
And he said that one of the things that he found when going, I think he came from a PR firm or a sort of some sort of comms firm, and then went to become internal comms for Handelsbanken. The first thing he noticed was just how little direction he had, right? He's like, feels quite exposed. He's like, well, where do I go? What do I do? And so I think there's the onus of leadership on people at the top, the CEO and so on, but also everywhere, right? Because you've got to self-lead. You've got to work out for yourself, where am I going to make an impact? Where am I going to contribute? Who am I going to associate with? Where am I going to place my bets? Right, all of those questions that anybody as a leader at whatever level needs to ask themselves. That's true of anybody in this type of culture, right?
Again, Handelsbanken is a great case, and also because they have been running like this for so long, right? All the way since 1970. And it means that we have a nice long period to look back at to check if this stuff kind of works from a performance point of view. And as you know, the performance of that bank is simply amazing. They have been performing better than the average of their competitors every year since 1972. They are among the most cost-effective universal banks in Europe, and I don't think it's a coincidence that they have never needed any bailout from the authorities because they messed it up. And I've seen some performance data from the UK, not just on financials, but also on customer satisfaction and employee satisfaction. And it was impressive. You had this comparison with other banks, and you had Handelsbanken way up here, and all the other banks bundled way down on that graph. So it's a big mystery for me that not more banks are copying this way of or trying to do something similar. And I was actually speculating about that because I have, as you know, in my book in the Handelsbanken case, I was speculating about why not more banks are trying to do the same. And before I finished the manuscript, I sent a letter to the guy who was the CEO at the time when this was introduced, Jan Wallander, and I sent him a mail and I got a letter back, handwritten letter, and he said that yes, you got this right, and I like it, but I have one comment, and that was on my speculation about why didn't other banks follow? Because I had written that, well, they are so far ahead, been doing this so long, and it is a bit complex, and then might seem difficult, and so on. And he said, well, all of that is right, but you have forgotten one thing. It's about power. These CEOs, they believe that they will lose their power if they take this route. What they haven't understood is that they will actually get more power if you do this. If power is about really helping an organization to perform better. And I'll never forget that comment, because I hadn't thought about that.
Right. And of course, it's what drives, I mean, I think that's another reason we don't see this type of approach in governments either. It's the leaders are driven often by personal power. And this, in the short term diminishes or appears to diminish personal power, but over the longer term, you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
You become a steward of these organizations that are alive with human potential. You end up with a lot more power, right? Because you're influencing a much stronger organism, the way I feel.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Now, I want to ask one very prosaic question, perhaps, just before we close out. And that may be for the people listening to this, like, oh, this is all very well, but where I work, I don't have the ear of the CEO. I don't have the ear of the CFO. I'm not going to eradicate budgets in my working life anytime soon. Like, is there anything somebody can do if they're operating within a budget cycle that's a sort of a baby step in this direction, or that might ameliorate their experience in dealing with budgets?
The answer is yes. First of all, I mean, most revolutions actually don't start at the top, right? And of course, you need the CEO and the CFO on board at some point in time. But it is actually possible to start this also further out in the organization. We have one example, Roche, quite big player. They're the daughter company in Sweden, Roche Sweden. They started out with big success, and that inspired the rest of Roche to get going. Also, there's a lot of stuff written on beyond budgeting, and you don't need to start with big books, but there are many articles that you'll find on LinkedIn, other places, short reads that gives people an idea about what this is about, and share these with colleagues, and see if you can send a few of them upstairs as well, and also check out. Your competitors might be among those that have started out, or similar companies. Check out what they are doing, and also check out the Beyond Budgeting Roundtable. It is a network of companies that are either on the journey or interested in this, and we bring these people together so that we can learn from each other. And as soon as this pandemic is over, we will resume our physical meetings where we typically meet in London every 6 months with great speakers and cases, and people get to meet each other.
Right.
And again, if your organization is on some kind of agile transformation journey, then remind those heading up this that what I just said earlier, that you will never succeed unless you also address the budgeting process. I've actually just written an article about this. It's called Agile Transformation and the Elephant in the Room. And you'll find it on LinkedIn. So, and then my final reflection here is that, everything that we have talked about here, it will happen. I don't care what it will be called, beyond budgeting or business agility or whatever. That's not important, but it will happen in some form or shape. And I'm convinced that when we in 15, 20 years' time look back at what was mainstream management in 2021, we will smile a bit, even have a laugh. Just like we today smile about the days before the internet. And how long is that? And as organizations, You can choose to be vanguards, early movers to get the competitive advantage out of this, or you can choose to be dragged into this as one of the laggards. I think that is a pretty simple choice to make.
What a beautiful note to end on. Bjarte, thank you very much. I will give a final plug to the book. I'm implementing Beyond Budgeting. There we have it, Unlocking the Performance Potential. Wonderful book, and just full of straightforward stories about how this has worked in different organizations. Very easy read, inspiring, very simple. You. So yes, thank you. We'll put the link to that article for all of those who are interested in the crossover between this and agile transformation, and of course the Beyond Budgeting organization and the roundtable. Well, thank you once again. It's been a pleasure. Continue the great work.
Likewise.
And yes, see you.
See you. Thank you.
How should I be saying goodbye in Norwegian? Come on, let's have a Norwegian sign-off.
Farvel, coming from farewell.
Say again.
Farvel.
Farvel. Okay.
Farvel. Farewell.
Farvel.
Farvel.
Fabulous. Thank you.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.